What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. 1, 2, 3. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I'm going to be dangerous here. And I am going to suggest a movie idea for Phase 4. And that movie idea is Excalibur. Now, I imagine a lot of people are just kind of like, who or what is Excalibur? Assuming anybody even cared enough to watch this video at all. Excalibur is, they're an interesting situation. Depending on how the story goes, it could be really, really cool, or it could be really boring. But the notion behind it is actually really awesome. So back in the 1960s, when Marvel first started blowing up, with Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Steve Ditko creating Spider-Man, all those different characters, bringing Captain America back, Marvel Comics was largely an American publication, meaning that almost all the superheroes, pretty much all the superheroes, were based out of America, with the exception of a handful. Uncanny X-Men changed that a little bit. And then you had pretty much all the stories being published in America. And so the result was that in 1976, Marvel broke out of that, and they launched an imprint called Marvel UK. I'm pretty sure it was in 1976. And they launched Marvel UK. And their inaugural title was Captain Britain Comics #1. Now, Captain Britain is the first real British character to get his own solo series. There were Marvel reprints that were being published in Britain, but in terms of having like an actual wholly owned British title, or I guess really, a British character, that was Captain Britain. And the cool thing about this is that Braddock was a guy who was met with like, God, I'm I really need to stop doing these things off the top of my head. Braddock was a guy, I want to say he was involved in a car wreck, or there was something that had gone on, and I want to say it was a villain or someone who had stepped in and messed with him. But then he was met by Merlin, and he was given a choice between the Amulet of Might, the Amulet of Right, or the Sword of Might. And he chose the Amulet of Right, which gives him super strength, speed, durability. I think he can travel at like supersonic speeds or something like that. But basically, he was like Britain's very own superhero. And it was pretty popular for a while. You saw some really cool stories too. Like I always say, the Crooked World story, the story of Mad Jim Jaspers, one of my favorite stories in the Captain Britain line of comics. It was amazing. But Captain Britain also has some pretty significant foes. Like his brother Jamie Braddock can like warp reality on a universal scale. I'm pretty sure it's universal, but he's a reality warper. He's really, really powerful. Like he's pretty strong. He's pretty powerful. but nonetheless, the whole idea of Excalibur is rooted in Marvel's efforts to take popular characters and blend them with unpopular characters in a title they couldn't really sell. And the reason why was because with Captain Britain being as popular as he wasn't that popular. I mean, he was popular among readers in Britain, but in the United States, a lot of people didn't really care about him because they really couldn't identify with him and didn't really resonate with him. And so the result of this is that in 1984, Marvel launched a story called Fall of the Mutants. And Fall of the Mutants is actually kind of cool. It crossed over, well, it didn't really cross over, but it dealt with the uncanny X-Men, it dealt with X-Factor, and it dealt with the New Mutants, which were Marvel's 3 X-Men titles at the time. And what you had is you basically had 3 separate stories that didn't really cross over or intertwine. Instead, they just kind of shared a theme. And the idea was basically the mutants were dangerous and so on and so forth. But the part that pertains to us is the uncanny X-Men part. And the reason why was that while you had Captain Britain and you had him over there doing his whole thing, and he had his girlfriend Megan who could shapeshift and all that kind of stuff, the uncanny X-Men were Marvel's like top comic. I mean, that was Marvel's comic book. The Uncanny X-Men were right up there at the top. I want to say that at their peak, DC's Teen Titans actually outsold the Uncanny X-Men, but like between those two publications, like Marvel and DC had the comic book industry on lockdown. It was crazy. From the mid-1970s running up into the mid-1980s, you couldn't get a hold on Marvel and DC. I mean, there was them and then everybody else. Like that's all there was to it. Valiant almost came close in the early 1990s, but then all that stuff happened. But the fact remains here, when it comes to the Excalibur team, the original roster was Captain Britain, Rachel Summers, Kitty Pryde, and Nightcrawler, maybe Megan. Anyway, the whole basis behind this was that in the Fall of Mutants storyline, you essentially had this crazy villain called the Adversary, which is really, really weird. Lord have mercy, it was weird. So what happened in this story is it dealt a lot with the character of Forge. And Forge is a mutant who is like Tony Stark, but the difference is that his abilities, his ability to like know how things work is his mutant power. Like Tony Stark is just that damn smart. That's how it is when it comes to his character in Marvel Comics. He's just that good. Forge is as good as Tony Stark. The reason why, or I don't know, it kind of depends. Tony Stark's never made a time machine, but Forge has made a time machine. I don't know, who cares? Anyway, the point is that if you were to have someone who shut off Forge's mutant powers, he'd be no more capable of doing any of the stuff that Tony Stark can do than like the average Joe walking down the street who's like a history teacher. Like he'd have no clue how to do any of the stuff that Stark can do. And he knows about, and he knows how to do the kind of things that Stark can do because his mutant power is to reverse engineer technology, to look at it and to know how it works. But the idea is that Forge is also a shaman for the Cheyenne people. And so what had happened was that in his early days as a kid, he'd basically been trained to be a shaman, to basically be someone who would be like their spiritual leader for the Cheyenne community. It doesn't mean that he would be sitting on a Native American reservation all the time, but it meant that if they called on him for his aid, then he would respond to his people before anything else. Ultimately, Forge rebuked that whole idea, and Forge basically joined the army and ended up, becoming like the assistant to the mutants or to the X-Men, actually a member of the X-Men that we know, and actually went on to form, this happened after the fall of mutants, but he actually went on to become the government liaison between the federal government and the X-Factor team. The second X-Factor team. The first X-Factor team, that was Cameron Hodge. Yeah, Cameron Hodge led Jean Grey, Iceman, Warren Worthington, Cyclops, and Angel. And that was Cameron Hodge. And then you had the whole like extinction agenda where he was like, screw you guys, and then decided to dick them all over. But it was extinction agenda was kind of cool. But in any event, the fact remains here. What ended up happening is there was this foe that the Cheyenne people had always been dealing with called the Adversary. And it was a way to kind of bring out like that whole cultural aspect of Native American history. And it was really, really cool for what it was. But the Adversary was basically like this demon entity. And in Marvel Comics, you have a lot of those. Like there's a lot of demon entities. I mean, you've got like the cosmic entities, and you've got like Mephisto, who's basically the devil. He's the one that makes people Ghost Riders. So you've got Hela, you've got Mistress Death, you have a lot of those things. On Earth, in the very early days of Earth in Marvel Comics, you had the Primal Gods, basically like these ancient deities. What actually ended up happening is they basically went crazy, started like killing and eating each other, devouring their powers. And then Gaia, who is the sentience of Earth, basically Mother Earth, called in like the god of all the gods, basically from Earth. And that god showed up, killed all the other ones, and then took off into the sun and just stayed there. And that was it. But you have like all these entities, during that civil war in like the early days of the gods, you had beings like Sidorak and the Octessens, so like, Volthoom, not Volthoom, Watum and those different guys that like Doctor Strange calls on. You had those different entities who took off to other dimensions, and so that's why like Sidorak has the Crimson Gem that Juggernaut uses, but it's from the Crimson Dimension, and Doctor Strange has the Crimson Bands of Sidorak, which he draws on Sidorak's power and all that kind of good stuff. But the whole idea was that Adversary was always trying to like break into the Marvel Universe and conquer the entirety of the universe. Eventually it did. And it was back at a time when Storm was in a relationship with, Forge had removed Storm's powers. And so she was, basically trying to get her powers back. But what ended up happening is basically it took the entirety of like the X-Men and like a handful of other heroes and characters, including Roma, who's kind of like this overseer of the multiverse. And what ended up happening is they basically, they all tried to fight against the Adversary. They didn't win. Forge cast a spell to send the Adversary back to his own dimension, but he used the souls of the X-Men to do it. That's what it was. So he used the souls of the X-Men to send the Adversary back to his own dimension, and then 9 of the X-Men died. And like it was a huge like Storm and like the most popular X-Men were basically quote unquote dead. Roma resurrected him and gave him the Siege Perilous. And what this did is it basically meant that the X-Men, according to what Roma did, made them invisible, so they could be superheroes without having to worry about anybody tracking them down. But the Siege Perilous was a device that they could use to reset their lives, basically meaning that they could use the Siege Perilous and they could start over. Nobody would know who they were. I don't remember if it's specified if they would keep their powers, but nobody would know who they were. Like nobody would remember them or anything like that. It would have this huge cascading effect across the universe. But what ends up happening here is in response to those X-Men dying, Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler are not there. They're actually recovering from the Mutant Massacre. I'm pretty sure that's right. They're recovering from the Mutant Massacre when Sinister sent Gambit and his Marauders to kill a whole bunch of Morlocks in the tunnels of New York, and then Gambit backed out at the last minute when he realized what was going on. And so because of that, Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler, I think, end up leaving the X-Men. They end up traveling to Britain, and they join with Captain Britain to form the Excalibur team. Now, Excalibur was kind of cool. Oh, I'm sorry, there's also Rachel Summers. Okay, if that wasn't enough history and enough information, man, you better be ready because I'm about to make your brain explode. Okay. Rachel Summers. Rachel Summers is a character who was cool for like one moment, and then Marvel didn't know what to do with her anymore. Like they never knew what to do with her character. There's one point where Rachel Summers has the Phoenix Force and she defeats Galactus or stalemates him or something like that, but like she goes toe to toe with Galactus. It's a pretty cool thing. Nowadays we expect that because it's the Phoenix, you know, it's a multiversal entity, but still, at the time, Rachel Summers was the daughter of Jean Grey and Scott Summers from the Days of Future Past. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen the Days of Future Past movie. Imagine that Kitty Pryde is the daughter of Jean Grey and Scott Summers, and that Wolverine's Kitty Pryde, and that's basically what happened. The mind of Kitty Pryde was sent into the past by Rachel Summers to stop Days of Future Past from happening. Marvel didn't really know how to handle alternate realities back then. All you really had in terms of like alternate realities were like Doctor Strange dimensions. Like Doctor Strange would go to like the dark dimension where Dormammu was. He would go to like the dream dimension where Nightmare hung out at. He would go to like these different realities and alternate universes or, you know, dimensions and so on, but that was the extent of it. Marvel never really had a scenario where somebody from the future would go into the past and change things, because then the question became, how do you reconcile that? And Marvel had to play it fast, like they had to figure it out quick. So Days of Future Past happens, the mind of Kitty Pryde goes into the past and prevents the assassinations of Moira McTaggart, the mutant geneticist, Senator Robert Kelly, and Charles Xavier, and that stops the Days of Future Past from happening. The problem was that the issue Marvel ran into was, if Kitty Pryde went into the past to stop Days of Future Past from happening, then how could she come from a future that doesn't exist anymore? And so what they did is they simply said, okay, the Days of Future Past is now an alternate reality. That future still happens, it's just a different universe now. It's not the main Marvel universe. And so what they did is they wrote a story called Days of Future Present. And in Days of Future Present, Rachel Summers is yanked from her reality into the main Marvel universe. She basically tries to figure out why hers didn't change. She ends up in the main Marvel universe, discovers Jean Grey and Scott Summers are still alive. There's kind of a weird situation that goes on there. And then she just kind of goes off and does her own thing, and she's free floating for like the next however many years she's been around, and that's it. Like, I mean, that's all. She's a character no one ever knows what to do with. No one, because I mean, she was originally designed to be a replacement for Jean Grey, but Jean Grey was back by that point in time, and so like X Factor was going on, and there was no one could figure out what to like how to write her or anything to do. So they just threw her on the Excalibur team, and she just stayed there for a little while. Following that, Excalibur was okay. I mean, you had things like TechNet, you had the Jim Jasper storyline, which was largely Captain Britain. I think that happened before Excalibur, but you had like a few things that went on with their team. The problem with Excalibur, and this is actually something that might actually work for the MCU, the problem with Excalibur and Marvel Comics is they seem so isolated. Like, it was like, okay, I sit down and read Marvel Comics, and in this specific location in America, I've got the Avengers, and I've got the X-Men, and I've got X-Force, and I've got Freedom Force, and I've got Stark's Force Works, and I've got like all these things going on, you know, and I've got like the Incredible Hulk, and you kind of have Alpha Flight, but nobody really cares about them. Like, you've got all these little things going on, and then it's like, all the way over there is Excalibur. That's how it felt to the average reader in terms of how the team interacted. And one of the things that fans really enjoy when it comes to Marvel Comics is having that shared universe. There's something to be said about sitting down and reading like, you know, X-Men and the Incredible Hulk annual number 98. And you see like X-Man, Nate Gray, and the Incredible Hulk cross over with one another. That would never happen, but you get to see it. X-Man is basically is what Cable would be if Cable was never screwed up. X-Man is like crazy powerful. He's like everything Cable could be. But still, there's something to be said about having that kind of crossover and that kind of interaction. And so for me as a reader, I never really got into Excalibur. From what I understand from like the really hardcore Captain Britain fans, they love its character and they love Excalibur, but it's one of those teams you never really hear of. You never really hear of like, you know, Excalibur versus Avengers. One, because why? And two, because it really wouldn't be believable. But still, what it would do in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the reason why this is a cool thing, is because when you look at the MCU, it is very indicative of like early 60s and 70s Marvel comics. Like, the MCU is a homegrown American thing. And I think that like bringing in stuff like Excalibur, bringing in things like Alpha Flight, bringing in things like the Savage Land and like Avalon and stuff like that would serve the purpose of like bolstering out the entirety of the community of the Marvel Universe and expanding on what's already there. I mean, on Netflix, you have things like The Hand, which is cool. I mean, you basically get this super secret Japanese mystic ninja organization, but they're not part of the movies. And because of the fact that, you know, there's the whole little, you know, pouting session going on between like the TV side and the movie side, you'll probably never see The Hand crossover with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Because I'll tell you right now, man, I'll tell you right now, I don't know. I mean, The Hand is okay on the Netflix series. Let me tell you something, man. if you had the hand from Marvel Comics rolled over into the movies, they would give the Avengers a run for their money. I mean, it would be insane. Like I would love to see that, like a Shadowland thing. If you don't know what that is, it's fine. It's not a huge deal. But I would love to see like a Shadowland MCU movie. Like Daredevil becomes possessed by like the beast of the hand, like the dark beast of the hand, and it's just like, I'm leading the hand now, and just like tries to conquer everything. That would be cool. Like that'd be pretty awesome. But nonetheless, I think it would really help to kind of expand and build on the world a bit. The thing about Excalibur is it kind of has to be done right, because if you do it like they did in the comics, people won't really care that much. You kind of have to give people a reason to be interested in them. Like, you don't want to have the Excalibur team in the MCU, and then they're just out there in the middle of no man's land, and you get a movie from them once every 10 years. And then like you may or may not see them referenced, because people will forget about them. Like people may or may not find them interesting. But again, I think that having like some European representation in the MCU is a great idea. And I think it really needs to happen. I think Excalibur would be a great way to make that work. But anyway, guys, let me know what you think down in the comments section. If you don't know what Excalibur is, I don't remember if I have a video explaining them or not. I want to say I do. I want to say I do have a video explaining Excalibur, but I might not. But anyway, let me know down in the comment section what you guys think. And if you're new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.